Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised, and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. The police operation to apprehend the man dubbed the Railway Killer had cost over £3 million and had been accomplished through the joint efforts of the Metropolitan, Surrey, Hertfordshire and British Transport Police. This joint task force brought about the arrest of a man in November 1986 who was accused of committing several rapes and 3 murders. Since his arrest, the case was built up against him in preparation for a trial at the Old Bailey, which commenced in February 1988. Join me as I delve into the trial of John Francis Duffy. The first couple of months of 1988 saw 2 high-profile cases being tried at the Old Bailey. The first was the trial of Kenneth Erskine, who, in the span of 4 months in 1986, had broken into the homes of at least 11 elderly individuals. Once inside the property, he sexually assaulted and strangled his vulnerable victims, earning him the press moniker the Stockwell Strangler. While his attacks targeted the elderly, Duffy's tended to focus on vulnerable young women and girls who he caught while they were walking alone, usually at night. And as he stood in the dock, his alleged offences were read out to the jury of 6 men and 6 women. He would be accused of 3 murders, 7 rapes, and 1 count of buggery, while also facing the allegations of common assault and malicious wounding pertaining to an attack carried out on his ex-wife and her new partner. Duffy entered a plea of not guilty to each charge, leaving it to the prosecution to prove otherwise. As he began his opening statement, prosecutor Anthony Hooper QC warned the jury that they were being asked to try a case which was to include an immense amount of information. It included 11 volumes of witness statements and numerous exhibits including images they may find upsetting to view. Mr. Hooper proceeded to outline the nature of the offences Duffy was accused of, stating, in late 1985 and in the first 5 months of 1986, 2 young women and a 15-year-old girl were murdered. The circumstances of their killing showed a marked similarity, but there was one feature which caught the public attention. The killing seemed to be connected with railway lines in and around London. Mr. Hooper proceeded to state that upon leaving school, Duffy had trained as a carpenter, through which he was taught how to use a tourniquet, a useful technique for securing pieces of wood to allow glue to set. But the prosecutor would allege the defendant went on to use this knowledge in order to strangle his victims. Upon completion of his training, Duffy secured employment with British Rail, where he worked between 1980 and 1982. This role enabled him to travel throughout the network, giving him an in-depth knowledge of the railway system, a knowledge he would utilise to pinpoint isolated stations where he could carry out his attacks. Following his departure from the railway company, Duffy was unemployed for 2 years, before securing work as a carpenter with Westminster Council. However, he was frequently absent, allegedly due to sickness. Duffy's activities outside of work spoke of a man who was keen on staying in shape. He would go out jogging, lifted weights and used a tool designed to strengthen the wrist and hands. A fitness fanatic, Duffy participated in martial arts classes near King's Cross. Here, the man who kept to himself during the sessions acquired skills he would later utilise to control and incapacitate his chosen targets. His undertaking of martial arts classes contradicted his claims to police that he had suffered a slipped disc, with Mr. Hooper stating that he wouldn't have been able to continue in the discipline with such an injury. The prosecutor would briefly detail how Duffy had acquired a preference for violent media, and it seemed he had been inspired by certain depictions in which strangulation was carried out through the use of fabric, as was evidenced by the manner in which he had murdered Anne, Martia, and Alison. Amongst the piles of violent and pornographic magazines, books, and films police found at Duffy's home, they also found a copy of the Anarchist's Cookbook, which was reported to be a guide to subversive activity. It was presented by the prosecution that Duffy had utilised this book as a guide which had helped him to identify the means of not only carrying out the attacks, but the steps to take in order to evade capture. Mr. Hooper read out one passage which detailed the importance of having an escape route because, quote, things are bound to go wrong. Going on to add, the prosecution will be able to paint a picture of a man who knew where he was, who had been there before, and who knew how to escape through woods and fields away from houses. The prosecution would also contend that the man in the dock was a, quote, shrewd, sharp, calculating man, a man who plans and knows what he is doing. He is certainly not inadequate or a backward person. Faced with crimes as horrible as these, perhaps it is natural for people to say, you could not do this unless you are sick, but he has nothing to do with sick. He is a shrewd, calculating killer and rapist. He has a stare. He drills with his eyes like two razor beams. He is someone who looks at you very hard and directly. This final detail, which had already been observed by witnesses and the police officers who had interviewed Duffy, would be featured in the newspaper headlines the following morning, as they described the defendant's piercing blue eyes as being laser eyes. Having given the breakdown of who Duffy was, Mr. Hooper proceeded to detail the individual charges, starting with the murder of Alison Day. He described how the 19-year-old disappeared while en route to meet her fiancé on the dark and cold evening of December the 29th, 1985. Her destination was just roughly a 5-minute walk from Hackney Wick train station, yet the blonde, slightly built teenager failed to arrive. The prosecution would contend that, quote, either on the train or just as she left it, she must have been accosted by someone. The prosecution say it was the defendant, Duffy. It would not be until the 15th of January 1986 that Alison's fate would be discovered, when her body was found in the River Lee, just a couple of 100 yards from the station platform. Mr. Hooper went on to explain the clues deduced from this discovery, stating, her watch had stopped, therefore we know she went into the river at 8:10 p.m. on the day she disappeared. The top half of her body was naked. Her sheepskin coat, found 200 yards away in the river, had been weighted down with granite blocks to prevent it coming to the surface. Regarding the injuries Alison had sustained, he informed the jury. She had head injuries and had obviously been knocked about. Her wrists had been tied together by her shirt, but that could well have been after her death. Most important of all, she had been strangled in the most extraordinary manner. The prosecutor described how the defendant had allegedly cut Alison's blouse and proceeded to tie these strips together, quote, with a knot and put round her neck. Then a tourniquet had been made. A piece of wood placed through a loop to pull the fabric tighter about Alison's neck, causing her death. Mr. Hooper admitted there was one point of contention, advising it was possible Alison had been raped. However, he added, but there is no charge, as it is difficult to prove after a body has been in a river. But there had been sexual interference. As already referenced by the prosecutor, Duffy was aware of ways in which to evade capture, and the prosecution argued that the body being placed into the river was evidence of this. The disposal method had proved partially successful, as it had prevented the ability to determine whether a rape had occurred. But the water had not completely removed all traces. These were found in the form of fibres recovered by a forensic scientist from Alison's sheepskin coat, which was subsequently matched with clothing found in Duffy's home. For his next attack, the defendant allegedly changed his disposal method, and while this showed his ability to adapt, the means of murder bore similar hallmarks to the death of Alison Day. At around 4 p.m. on April 17, 1986, Martia Tumboza set off to buy sweets from the neighbouring village, opting to take a path which ran alongside a railway line instead of remaining on the main road. As she traversed the track, the 15-year-old was forced to pause by a string stretched across the path, which, Mr. Hooper noted, if she had gone on, it would have caught her around her middle and she would have fallen off her bike. It was the prosecution's assertion that this trap had been set by Duffy, using a fishing line, part of which was recovered from his parents' home. The obstruction was successful in causing the teenager to stop, giving the defendant the opportunity to ambush her. The prosecution then proposed that Martia was forced, possibly at knife point, across a field and into woodland, where she was rendered unconscious by a blow to the head. Her hands were then bound behind her back in a prayer-like pose, and in the secluded glade, the defendant was alleged to have raped and strangled the teenager. Initially, it seemed the attacker had attempted to utilize the 15-year-old's leather belt for his macabre task, but when this broke, her scarf was used instead. Upon her death, the assailant made efforts to destroy incriminating evidence by setting fire to the body. However, a forensic search of the area recovered several important clues. There was a shoe impression, which was the same size and shared a tread pattern with a pair recovered from the defendant's home. He also left several Swan Vesta matches behind, and a stick which was later identified as the object used to tighten the scarf about Martia's neck. Tissue paper was also recovered from near the teenager's thigh, with the prosecutor pointing out that the box of Swan Vista matches had tissues inside, and it was retrieved from Duffy's home, prompting Mr. Hooper to ask the court, what could this be other than this man's rape kit, adding, it was ready for another rape or murder. Mr. Hooper would indicate to the jury that the evidence recovered from the scene proved crucial to the case as a whole, with there being marked similarities between Martia's murder and those of Alison and Duffy's alleged final victim, Anne Locke. The prosecution detailed that 29-year-old Anne had been married for just 4 weeks when she disappeared while making her way home from work on Sunday the 18th of May 1986. Yet she never arrived at her home in Brookman's Park. Mr. Hooper stated that the prosecution contended, either on the train or as she got off it, she met the man who was to kill her. It was their contention that this man was the defendant, who likely coerced Anne at knife point along a track which ran parallel with the train line between Brookman's Park and Potter's Bar. Upon reaching an isolated spot amidst open countryside and woodland, Duffy was believed to have, quote, forced her down the wooded bank, where the decomposed body was found 2 months later by railway workers, adding that a pathologist had determined Anne's death had been caused by a 12-inch woolen sock being pushed into her mouth, blocking the airway. The prosecutor went on to warn the jury that they were to view images of Mrs. Locke, which he stated are terrible pictures, I am afraid. These images depicted the damage caused to Anne's body by the fire the killer had set, with black scorch marks on her stomach. Beside her remains were the charred remnants of the 29-year-old's handbag, with tests showing that the perpetrator had used lighter fluid to set the fire. As with his previous attacks, Duffy had taken items from the victim. With Anne, he took her address book and diary, although these were discarded soon afterwards. However, as with his other victims, keys or money was also taken. In the case of Martia and Alison, it was noted that their underwear was also missing. Mr. Hooper pointed out that given the similarities between the murders, especially the proximity to train lines and the use of a tourniquet, it was highly unlikely that the murders were unrelated. Having outlined the connections between the murders, the prosecutor moved on to the series of rapes which commenced in 1984. and upon Duffy's arrest, 7 of his victims positively identified him in a lineup. One of the connecting factors between the rapes and the murders was the use of the rape kit already referenced by Mr. Hooper. Interviews with the rape victims helped to explain the presence of the tissue found on Mortia's thigh, with several of the women and girls describing that they were ordered to wipe themselves clean with the tissue following the assaults, after which their assailant burnt the tissue with the Swan Vista matches in an effort to remove any traces. When asked during police interviews to explain the presence of the Swan Vista matches and the tissues recovered from his home, Duffy alleged the tissues were simply in the box to stop the matches rattling around when he was jogging, an explanation Mr. Hooper said must rank as one of the most ridiculous excuses. The prosecutor went on to outline the numerous rapes the defendant stood accused of, with many bearing the characteristic hallmarks found throughout the series of offences. The first assault he was accused of occurred in June 1984 on a 23-year-old woman who was blindfolded and raped at West Hampstead Station by Duffy and another man who had not yet been identified. This was followed by an attack in February 1985, during which an 18-year-old student nurse was set upon at Hadley Wood Station. Then Duffy was alleged to have attacked in Camden Town, with another attack taking place in Hendon. This latter attack saw the 20-year-old victim being ordered to comb her pubic hair, which the prosecution highlighted as another sign of Duffy's attempts to avoid being caught, going on to suggest he had possibly started this forensic countermeasure after being arrested for the assault of his wife, during which his own body hair was combed for evidence. Then on the 20th of November he carried out an attack close to Copthall Sports Centre, an event notable because Duffy was said to have had his dog Bruce with him at the time. Just over a month after this attack, on the 24th of December 1985, a woman was unnerved by a man in the train carriage with her, as he kept staring at her. Frightened by his presence, she hurried off the train when it reached her stop, and instantly sought out 2 men who were on the platform and pretended that one of them was her husband. Her actions prevented her from coming to harm, causing Mr. Hooper to comment, "You may think she is a very lucky person." A statement given more weight given that just 5 days later, Alison Day was murdered. It was purported that Duffy had now escalated his offences to murder, yet on October the 21st, 1986, the accused triple killer committed his last rape on a 14-year-old girl as she headed home from school in Watford. A month after this, he was finally apprehended. The prosecutor pointed out to the court the common threads which connected the rapes and murders, including the use of the victim's clothing to create bindings, gags and ligatures. Mr. Hooper also advised that DNA was recovered. However, despite the recent advancements in this area of forensics, the samples were insignificant for testing. They were, however, able to connect Duffy through blood found in traces of semen, which was found to be the rare blood group which was said to be akin to the defendant's. As the prosecution had also pointed out, Duffy had taken steps to remove evidence. This ranged from burning the bodies to getting his victims to wipe themselves clean after they were assaulted. It seemed he had learned from previous mistakes. For instance, he left a shoe impression at Martia Tamboza's murder, which possibly prompted him to disturb the soil with a stick following his final attack in October of 1986. Despite these countermeasures, evidence and the positive identifications by his surviving victims would support that the defendant was responsible. However, Mr. Hooper pointed out that Duffy claimed he suffered from amnesia, and thus could not remember where he was or what he was doing on the dates the attacks occurred. This explanation, Mr. Hooper would suggest, was a total sham, informing the jury that this loss of memory apparently occurred, quote, on the very day he had been interviewed in connection with these inquiries. adding that investigations had determined that for each of the attacks, Duffy was not at work, and the jury would hear about evidence and witness testimonies which connected him to each assault. The first witness to take to the stand was Margaret Duffy, the defendant's ex-wife, who would proceed to detail her experience living with the accused, while also providing an insight into his character. Her testimony provided the foundation of the evidence pertaining to the rape and assault Duffy had committed against herself and her boyfriend. It would also draw parallels between her situation and those who fell prey to her ex-husband's depraved nature. The petite 25-year-old Margaret told the court that she and Duffy married in 1980, yet within the space of 3 years Duffy changed, particularly after he learned he wasn't able to have children. This news caused him to become depressed, and Duffy attempted to take his own life on 2 occasions. But it also seemed to change his personality, with a briefly happy union becoming a very abusive relationship. Margaret went on to describe in detail the form this abuse took, stating, "I couldn't bear to look at him or touch him. He couldn't understand why. The marriage was just fighting all the time. He wanted sex almost every day and used to force himself on me. It started off with verbal threats and then he used to hit me. He was too strong for me. It wasn't intercourse in the ordinary way. He used to tie my hands with a belt or the cord from a dressing gown behind my back." She continued by disclosing her realization that, quote, "The more I protested, the more he got aroused. On one occasion, talking quite calmly for a change, he told me that he had raped a girl and that he had enjoyed it." Margaret also spoke of how Duffy's character changed, particularly after he learned he couldn't father a child, noting that his moods were very changeable from one minute to the next. He could be really nice when he wanted to be, then without warning or reason, he would become a raving madman. She then went on to explain how she had attempted to walk away from the marriage twice, first in 1984, then again in June 1985. This was the final time and took place the day after they had held a party for their wedding anniversary. Despite leaving, she had no choice but to go back to her former marital home in order to collect clothing which she had no room for in the tiny bedsit she had moved to, and she needed to collect her mail that had been delivered to her former home. Each time she had reluctantly returned, he would force her to have intercourse with him, recalling that once he tricked me by saying that he had baked a cake and wanted me to taste it. He told me to close my eyes and open my mouth, and then he tried to stuff a hanky into my mouth and around my throat. I managed to push him off, and he apologized. I really thought he was going to kill me." Having described this incident, which echoed the manner in which Anne Locke was killed, she proceeded to explain how Duffy, quote, "used to get fidgety just before a changing mood. His eyes were very scary. You couldn't stare at him. You had to look away. After the assaults, he would be apologetic, insisting he didn't know what came over him. But the incident with the handkerchief prompted her to acquire a court injunction to prevent her violent partner from contacting her." Margaret insisted that she had no inclination that her husband was responsible for the rapes or murders, although he did once tell her he had sexually assaulted a woman because his wife had driven him to it. She told the court she found this hard to believe, but he allegedly said that a personal stereo he had gifted his wife had belonged to the victim. This was the only time he indicated directly that his nature was darker than even she could comprehend, although she would concede she was aware that he had, quote, "quite a selection of knives, penknives and big knives, with big blades. He used to carry a razor blade in a brass casing." All these weapons she believed had been accumulated due to his love of martial arts, never imagining they would be utilised for more nefarious deeds. However, she acknowledged she had been on the receiving end of his violent nature, detailing how he became particularly volatile after she walked away from the marriage and started a new relationship. In August 1985, Duffy violently assaulted both Margaret and her new boyfriend. However, he once again showed his eagerness to avoid being punished for his actions, as he proceeded to break the injunction she had against him in order to ask her to drop the charges. Margaret alleges that he claimed that if she didn't revoke her accusations of assault, the police may use his blood to link him to another crime, but he did not disclose what he was referring to. After opening up to the court regarding her relationship with the accused, Margaret remained on the stand to face cross-examination from the defence counsel, Mr. David Farrington, who would question why Margaret kept returning to Duffy's residence even after she walked away. The defence suggested that, quote, "You made love to him 4 or 5 times. It was a case of absence makes the heart fonder." Despite her denials, Mr. Farrington pushed back. "This man, who you cannot stand to touch, the man with the scary eyes, the man who has tied you up, put a handkerchief in your mouth, you are going back on a regular basis to visit." The witness admitted she had returned to her former marital home, but stated, "I was not going back on a regular basis. I just went back to collect some important mail." Yet the defence continued to pry, asking Margaret, "Why were you going back at all, if you were frightened of him? You're not telling the truth about your relationship with John Duffy." Fighting back her emotions, Margaret continued to deny that her visits had been anything more than to retrieve clothing and mail. Mr. Farrington went on to question the timing of Margaret's decision to leave Duffy, pointing out that she had walked out the morning after a party celebrating their wedding anniversary, which her husband had described as a bolt out of the blue. Continuing on this point, Mr. Farrington implied that Margaret had left Duffy because she had started seeing another man, but the witness vehemently stated that her relationship with Hungarian-born Imre Lovis started after she left her husband. While the defence were unable to get Margaret to yield at this point, they did establish that despite obtaining an injunction against Duffy in July 1986, the pair still interacted. However, the witness explained, "He would ring me up at work and ask me to go and see him. He was pestering me. I contacted him twice after the injunction. One of these times, she had visited her estranged husband's home and had taken a friend's baby with her, with the defence alleging she had said to Duffy, 'Maybe one day we might have a child like this.' Margaret responded, 'John could not have kids.' This was met by the defence informing the court, yes he could. He would just have to try longer than most men. He did not have the potency. Referencing the couple's struggles to conceive, Mr. Farrington got Margaret to acknowledge that she had acquired £250 from Duffy's parents, after telling them that she and her husband wished to see a Harley Street fertility specialist. Mr. Farrington would continue the topic of finances by insinuating she embellished her recollections with juicy details in order to sell her story to the press. This suggestion ignited what was described as a heated exchange between the witness and the defence counsel, during which Margaret insisted his claims were not true and ended her time on the stand steadfast in her denials. With the court being told about the turbulent marriage, they would also hear details regarding the attack carried out by Duffy on Margaret and her new partner, who took to the stand to recount the incident. Hungarian-born Imre Lovis told the court that at just after midnight on August the 29th, 1985, Margaret arrived at his Hendon flat accompanied by Duffy. It was clear a violent incident had occurred between them. She appeared shaken and had a black eye. Lovis went on to claim that Duffy stormed into the flat, accosted a friend who was also present, before turning his anger on the Hungarian, who recalled that Duffy behaved like a madman. "He hit me with the knife on the temple," adding, "I had to have 8 stitches. His testimony continued as he described how his assailant wielded a kosh in one hand, which had been used to strike the friend over the head twice, while a butterfly flick knife in the other hand was waved about erratically. Mr. Lovis stated that Duffy was jumping up and down, screaming he would kill everybody. But as the madman had approached Mr. Levis with the blade, a struggle between the two men ensued, during which the knife was dropped and hastily picked up by Margaret. But her defiance was met with violence. As Mr. Levis explained, Duffy hit her over the head with the stick and she fell to the floor. He was still jumping up and down and threatening everybody. Following this incident, Duffy was arrested and faced several charges, including malicious wounding and sexual assault. Despite the severity of these allegations, combined with the objections of the police, who believed the accused should be held pending trial, Duffy was granted bail. 4 months after this decision, Alison Day was killed, followed 2 months later by Marcia Tamboza. And while this would stir up anger, it was further compounded when it came to light that Duffy had been stopped just a couple of days before Anne Locke's murder and found to be in possession of a blade. Yet despite being on bail for a violent offence, he was still permitted to walk the streets. PC Peter Basnett, the officer who arrested Duffy just days before Anne Locke's murder, would be called to testify. He recalled seeing Duffy loitering in the street near North Wheel train station in May 1986 and admitted he recognised the short, ginger-haired figure as an individual who was on bail pending trial. This knowledge prompted PC Basnett to approach Duffy and inquire what he was doing in the area. Receiving the response that he was there to meet a friend, the officer then asked to search the man, who willingly agreed. Upon conducting the search, PC Basnett found a silver butterfly knife inside a jacket pocket, which matched the description of the blade used to threaten Margaret and her partner. But when told this, Duffy challenged the officer to show his estranged wife the knife, as she would deny it was the same one. The officer went on to question why Duffy needed to carry the weapon at all, receiving the response that he used it for, quote, all sorts of things. I use it at work to cut tiles with. Knowing that at that time Duffy was unemployed, PC Basnett pointed out that being out of work made it unnecessary to carry the knife. However, this was countered by the defendant allegedly stating, if I got a knot in my laces, I would use it to cut the lace. Not satisfied with this explanation, PC Basnett arrested Duffy for possession of an offensive weapon, but this was not deemed sufficient to detain him, and within days Duffy was alleged to have claimed the life of Anne Locke. As proposed by the prosecution, Mr. Hooper, the defendant had utilised his martial arts training in order to carry out the series of rapes and murders, skills he had learned under the guidance of Mr. David Archer, who ran courses at King's Cross. Before the court, Mr. Archer would detail the type of techniques he taught, including moves which could paralyse or inflict serious pain on an opponent. Mr. Archer recalled that when Duffy started attending in 1985, it was evident that he had prior experience of the discipline and proved to be a quick learner. He also recalled that the defendant was one of the students who began attending his classes in North London, where he taught the use of agricultural weapons. With regards to his interactions with Duffy, the witness stated that the ginger-haired man tended to keep to himself, although he had made friends with another pupil, Ross Mockridge. It was through Ross that Traynor learned that Duffy had been mugged by 2 men outside Kilburn train station in July 1986, and through this attack he had lost his memory. Following this incident, Duffy had been absent for a few sessions, and when he returned, Mr. Archer stated he instructed Ross to take Duffy to one side and get him caught up on the lessons he had missed. Watching the 2 men practice what he considered extremely complicated techniques, Mr. Archer noted, I saw no hesitation in Duffy's performance whatsoever, going on to affirm that there appeared to be no issues with the defendant's ability to recall certain moves despite his claims of memory loss. The prosecution's assertion that the claims of amnesia were false was strengthened further when Ross Mockridge stood before those gathered at the Old Bailey to provide evidence of the extraordinary steps Duffy had taken to avoid being held accountable for his crimes. The young man described that in July 1986 he had reluctantly agreed to injure his friend. having been assured it would help get Duffy out of trouble. He described that the pair had been returning from a martial arts class when, quote, John told me he wanted me to help fake a memory loss. When we got to the flat, he said he wanted me to cut him and punch him, and make it seem he had been assaulted in the street. He explained that 2 men were looking for him, and he had to fake a loss of memory, or else he would be in trouble. Ross went on to explain, John handed me the razor. As he was talking, I got him with the razor, so it was not painful as much as it would have been if he was bracing himself for it. It was a slashing movement on his chest through his shirt. First, John did not think he had been cut at all. Then he put his fingers through his torn shirt and pulled at the wound with his finger. I saw the wound was fairly deep, and I was very shocked and said, Oh God, what have I done? Duffy said that, no, it was good. Then I had to hit him. I said I did not want to do it, but he said I had to help him as his life was at stake, so I agreed to punch him. However, when Mr. Mockridge weakly punched Duffy twice across the face, he was urged to hit him harder. Therefore Ross struck his friend in the eye, causing the man to stumble backwards. Despite this, Duffy, who was now bleeding from the chest and red in the face, assured his friend that he was okay. He then passed Ross £100 in cash as payment for assisting him, before leaving to head to the hospital, where he was going to claim he had been mugged and had lost his memory. Having discredited Duffy's claims of amnesia, Ross also provided an insight into the mind of the man in the dock, recalling that his friend had frequently talked about rape and had once said, quote, It was a natural thing for a man to think about. Duffy had also asked him whether he had ever considered sexually assaulting a woman, to which Mr. Mockridge had replied he wouldn't. Duffy went on to point out a lone female walking nearby and calmly asked, You mean you would not want to drag her off to some bushes? 20-year-old Ross told the court that he was quite surprised by his friend's comment, and went on to recall another occasion where the topic was raised, stating, One night while walking down an alleyway, he asked again about rape. I said I thought it would mess things up psychologically with a life. John once mentioned the percentage of rapes which happened and which were not reported. The nature of these conversations could indicate that Duffy didn't just see Ross as a friend, but perhaps he was testing to see whether he would be a suitable partner in crime. Yet the 20-year-old didn't seem willing to follow him down that dark path, with Ross believing that Duffy was all talk and wasn't actually capable of such actions. The witness conceded this was one of the reasons he initially struggled when he first learned of the allegations against his friend, stating, It was difficult to come to terms with what John was accused of. Because of my great friendship and feelings for him, I tried to protect him at first. Mr. Mockridge explained that this bond was the reason he was initially reluctant during police questioning, and the details he provided them came out gradually, citing this was due to his friendship with Duffy, adding, It would have been extremely difficult to give all my evidence about him to police in one go. The witness went on to discuss his feelings of depression following his friend's arrest, admitting he had contemplated ending his own life, a situation which had prompted him to begin sessions with a psychiatrist. Given the potential damage Ross's evidence could pose to Duffy's amnesia claims, the defence tried to undermine his testimony by suggesting that Mr. Mockridge was actually a lonely introvert who lived in a world of fantasy. This was a notion the witness denied while under cross-examination by the defence counsel Mr. David Farrington, defending himself further when it was suggested that his story pertaining to how Duffy sustained his injuries was a fabrication. As Mr. Farrington inferred, he did this to end the police scrutiny. This claim prompted Mr. Mockridge to reply, I reject that completely. I am on oath in this court, and what I say is true. However, the defence would bring to light that following the incidents between Duffy, Margaret and her new partner, Mr. Mockridge had provided his friend with a character reference, the testimonial of which was read out to the court and stated that Duffy, quote, has never shown any signs of a suspect temper in my company. Neither has he ever done anything in my presence to suggest violence. On the contrary, he has a quiet, peaceful, non-violent nature. He is very definitely not a person to provoke anyone. He has always been helpful and friendly. He is the type of person who would always be in control of himself, except in times of extreme provocation. He is well disciplined and not easily frustrated. I have never heard him raise the tone of his voice or threaten anyone. It would also be alleged that during police questioning, detectives had asked Mr. Mockridge whether he had been in a sexual relationship with Duffy, which the witness denied, stating that he looked up to the man almost 10 years his senior as a brother, adding that he, quote, would do anything for him, more or less. With the departure of Mr. Mockridge from the stand, the time came for the individual offences to be presented to the court, including the testimony of those who had been attacked by the man known as the Railway Killer. It was a harrowing experience for all involved, yet the trial would hold further heartache for one relative in particular. Join me next time as the trial of John Duffy concludes.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.